The last box was already in my car when Maren stopped me in the apartment doorway and said the one sentence that made the entire year behind us suddenly feel different. Morning sunlight poured through the tall living room windows, turning the dust in the empty apartment into tiny floating sparks, and for a moment everything looked strangely beautiful: the bare walls, the faded marks where our furniture had been, the 2 coffee mugs still sitting beside the sink because neither of us had remembered to pack them. I had expected moving day to feel ordinary. Awkward, maybe. A little sad. I had not expected Maren to stand there with swollen eyes, holding the spare key I had left on the counter as though it weighed more than anything she had ever carried. I had not expected her voice to shake when she asked whether I really planned to leave without understanding. And I definitely had not expected her to step closer, look straight at me, and whisper, "You never figured it out, did you?" In that instant, every strange kindness, every midnight cup of coffee, every argument that ended too quickly, every almost conversation I had ignored came rushing back so hard that I forgot how to breathe. If you believe kindness deserves a second chance, please take a moment to like, comment, share this story, and subscribe to Dream Discipline. Sometimes the people who change our lives are the ones standing quietly beside us while we are too distracted by our own pain to notice them. My name is Nolan Mercer, and 1 year before that morning, I had not been looking for a roommate. I had been looking for a place where nobody knew me. My engagement had ended 3 months before I moved into the apartment on Hawthorne Street, and although people kept telling me that breakups happened every day, mine had left behind the kind of silence that followed me everywhere. I had spent 5 years believing I was building a future with someone, only to learn that she had been slowly imagining a life without me. By the time the relationship officially ended, I was exhausted from trying to repair something that had already been abandoned. I left our shared apartment, sold half the furniture, put the rest in storage, and answered the first decent rental listing I found. The person who opened the door that Saturday morning was Maren, a 29-year-old freelance illustrator with an oversized gray sweatshirt, paint on one wrist, and the suspicious expression of someone who regretted posting a roommate ad the second strangers began answering it. She showed me the small bedroom, explained that she worked from home, warned me that the kitchen faucet screamed when turned too far to the left, and told me she hated loud television after midnight. I told her I worked at a logistics company downtown, cooked badly, and had no intention of throwing parties. We agreed within 20 minutes that we could probably survive living together. At first, that was all it was: survival between two people who respected closed doors. Maren woke early and worked at the dining table where sunlight fell across her sketchbooks. I left before 8 most mornings and usually returned tired, carrying some supermarket dinner I could heat in 5 minutes. We divided shelves in the refrigerator, wrote utility payments on a whiteboard, and communicated through sticky notes whenever one of us forgot to buy trash bags. She seemed cheerful enough, but not in an exhausting way. Her humor was quiet. She noticed things. If I came home soaked from rain, a towel would mysteriously appear over the back of a chair. If she worked through lunch, I would leave half my takeout beside her laptop. Neither of us called those gestures friendship. They were simply what decent roommates did, or at least that was what I told myself. I had become careful with closeness. My engagement had taught me that comfort could disappear without warning, so I had decided that being needed was dangerous and needing anyone was worse. Then, little by little, Maren began slipping past the walls I had built without ever appearing to try. One bright Tuesday morning, I overslept before an important presentation and ran into the kitchen expecting to leave without breakfast. She was standing near the counter with 2 travel mugs and a bag containing a toasted sandwich. She handed them to me and said she had heard me practicing the presentation through the wall the night before and figured I would need fuel. Another morning, I found a sticky note on my bedroom door reminding me that my mother's birthday was that day because Maren had apparently heard me mention it weeks earlier. When my car battery died in our parking lot, she sat on the curb beside me while I waited for roadside assistance, even though she had a deadline. When I caught the flu, she left soup outside my bedroom door, never making a performance of caring. She simply did things, then walked away before I could decide whether they meant anything. What I failed to understand was that Maren was carrying her own wounds just as carefully. She rarely spoke about her family, and when she did, her sentences became shorter. I learned that she had grown up moving between cities after her parents divorced, that her father disappeared from her life for years at a time, and that her mother had taught her not to expect anyone to stay. She had been engaged once too, though hers had ended 2 years before we met. One afternoon while we were cleaning the apartment, she found an old wedding invitation buried inside a drawer. It was hers. She stared at it for several seconds before tearing it in half and dropping it into the trash. When I asked if she was okay, she smiled and said old paper could not hurt anyone unless you kept reading it. At the time, I thought it was a clever sentence. Later I understood it was the closest she had come to admitting how afraid she was of becoming attached again. Summer settled over the city, and our lives became strangely intertwined. Because Maren worked from home, she sometimes joined me for lunch near my office when she needed to escape the apartment. On Saturdays, we walked to the neighborhood market, arguing over which coffee beans were overpriced and whether anyone truly needed 6 kinds of mustard. We developed rituals without discussing them. Saturday breakfast belonged to the little diner 3 streets away. Sunday afternoons meant laundry and old movies. Whenever one of us had a terrible week, we ordered noodles from the same restaurant and sat on the living room floor because neither of us had ever bothered buying a proper dining set. Nothing romantic happened. That was the strange part. There were no dramatic kisses in the kitchen, no obvious confessions, nothing I could point to and say, there, that was the moment everything changed. Instead, affection accumulated like daylight filling a room. Quietly. Gradually. Almost invisibly, yet I remained emotionally somewhere else. My former fiancée, Sienna, had left me with a question I could not stop asking: what had been wrong with me? I had become convinced that I must have been too dull, too predictable, too easy to leave. So when Maren complimented me, I dismissed it. When she waited up because I was late coming home, I assumed she was simply considerate. When she looked disappointed after I mentioned going on a date, I told myself she was tired. That date was with a coworker named Talia, a smart, kind woman who deserved someone more present than I was. We went out 3 times, and each time I found myself comparing the conversation to the effortless way Maren and I could talk while washing dishes. After the 3rd date, Talia told me gently that I seemed like someone standing in a doorway, unable to decide which room he wanted to enter. I knew exactly what she meant, but I still refused to see what was directly in front of me. The closest Maren ever came to telling me happened in early autumn. It was a clear Saturday afternoon, and we were carrying groceries upstairs when the paper bag in her arms tore open. Apples rolled across the hallway, a jar of pasta sauce nearly shattered, and we both dropped to the floor laughing as we chased everything down. For several minutes we sat there like idiots among scattered groceries while sunlight streamed through the stairwell window. Maren looked at me differently then. The laughter faded from her face, and she said there were some things people missed because they were looking too hard for something dramatic. I asked what she meant. She shook her head, stood up, and said nothing. I let the moment go because letting moments go had become one of my specialties. 3 weeks later, my company offered me a promotion in another city. The salary increase was significant, the role was exactly the kind of opportunity one had spent years chasing, and the move would put me closer to my younger brother. Everyone told me I was lucky. I told myself they were right. When I told Maren over breakfast, she froze with her coffee halfway to her mouth. Then she smiled and congratulated me. I remember feeling oddly disappointed by how easily she accepted the news, though I had no right to expect anything else. She asked when I would leave. I said 6 weeks. She nodded and said she would start looking for another roommate. Those 6 weeks changed the apartment. Nothing dramatic happened, yet the air between us felt heavier. Maren spent more time working in her bedroom. Our Saturday diner breakfasts became irregular. Sometimes I would find her standing in the kitchen staring out the window, and when I entered she would suddenly become busy. I assumed she was stressed about replacing me. I offered to help find someone. She said she would handle it. One evening I heard her crying quietly behind her door. I stood in the hallway for almost a minute, hand raised, wanting to knock. I never did. I told myself she deserved privacy. The truth was uglier. I was afraid that if I opened that door, she might tell me something that would make leaving difficult. Moving day arrived under a bright spring-like sun despite being late October. I had arranged for a small moving company to take the larger boxes. By 10 in the morning, my bedroom was empty except for pale rectangles on the walls where photographs had hung. Maren helped carry books, taped boxes, and made coffee. We talked about practical things: the security deposit, the internet bill, the plant near the balcony that technically belonged to both of us because neither remembered who had purchased it. Every sentence carefully avoided the subject of what our year together had meant. Around noon, the movers left. I carried the final box downstairs, placed it in my car, then climbed back up to return my key. That should have been the end. I placed the key on the kitchen counter. I told Maren to call if any mail arrived. She nodded. I walked toward the door, then she said my name. Something in her voice stopped me. I turned. She was holding the key I had just left behind. Her eyes were red, though I had not seen her cry. She asked whether I really planned to leave like that. I told her I did not know what else I was supposed to say. She gave a small, broken laugh and looked down at the key. Then she asked how someone could notice when she changed coffee brands, remember which side of the couch she preferred, know when she was pretending to be fine, and still miss the most obvious thing about her. I stared at her. That was when she stepped closer and whispered, "You never figured it out, did you?" The apartment became completely silent. She did not make some grand romantic speech. That would not have been Maren. She simply told me that somewhere between burnt dinners, grocery runs, bad movies, flu medicine, and ordinary mornings, she had fallen in love with me. She told me she had tried not to. She knew I was hurt. She knew I was rebuilding myself. She had promised herself she would never become another person waiting for someone emotionally unavailable to choose her. But feelings, she said, had arrived anyway. She admitted that when I announced my promotion, she had spent that night sitting alone at the kitchen table realizing I might leave without ever knowing, and suddenly, the entire year rearranged itself inside my memory: the travel mug before my presentation, the towel after the rain, the way she smiled whenever I came home earlier than expected, her silence when I mentioned dates, the apples in the hallway, the sentence about people missing things because they were waiting for something dramatic that I had thought love would announce itself because my last relationship had ended so loudly. I had forgotten that love could also be quiet. I asked Maren why she had waited until the last minute. Her answer broke something open inside me. She said she had spent her childhood watching people ask others to stay when they clearly wanted to leave, and she had promised herself never to beg for anyone. She said if I wanted the new job, I should take it. She did not want guilt to become the reason I stayed. She only could not let me disappear believing that our year had meant nothing more than shared rent. For the first time in months, maybe years, I stopped trying to calculate the safe decision. I walked toward her. I told her the truth I had been hiding even from myself. I told her that every apartment I had searched for in the new city looked wrong because none of them had her sketchbooks on the table. I told her I had been pretending my sadness about leaving was nostalgia when it was actually fear. I told her that after being abandoned once, I had trained myself to distrust happiness whenever it appeared. If something felt important, I minimized it. If someone cared, I called them kind. If I cared back, I found a practical explanation. Maren began crying then, and so did I. We did not solve everything that morning. I did not dramatically cancel the promotion within 5 minutes, and she did not ask me to. Real life was more complicated than that. We sat on the empty living room floor for nearly 2 hours and talked more honestly than we had during the entire year. I admitted that I wanted the promotion but not necessarily the city. She admitted she had been considering moving her freelance work somewhere new anyway. We discussed possibilities that neither of us had allowed ourselves to imagine before. Remote work. Commuting temporarily. Visiting. Trying a relationship instead of demanding a lifelong promise before we had even begun. for once, neither of us ran that I still moved that afternoon. That surprises people when they hear this story. They expect me to say I unpacked everything and stayed. But growth is not always proving love by abandoning every plan. Sometimes it is learning to stop treating distance as abandonment. Maren stood beside my car under the bright afternoon sun, her hair moving in the breeze, and instead of pretending we were just roommates saying goodbye, I kissed her forehead and promised I would call when I arrived. That I did. Then I called the next morning, and the morning after that. 3 weeks later, she visited. 2 months later, my company approved a hybrid arrangement that allowed me to spend part of each month back in the city. 6 months after that, Maren found a studio near my new office and decided to move, not for me alone, but because the city offered better opportunities for her work too. We rented a different apartment together, this time with both our names deliberately on the lease and no pretending that we were simply splitting expenses. There were difficult moments. Love did not magically erase our old fears. I still sometimes withdrew whenever conflict appeared because some part of me expected every disagreement to become a goodbye. Maren sometimes assumed silence meant rejection because that was what silence had meant in her childhood. We had to learn each other deliberately. We learned to ask questions instead of making assumptions. We learned that reassurance was not weakness. We learned that loving someone did not mean demanding certainty about the next 30 years. Sometimes it meant showing up tomorrow, then choosing each other again the day after. Years later, I still have the spare key from our first apartment. Maren framed it in a tiny shadow box as a joke and placed it beside one of her illustrations in our hallway. Beneath it she wrote only one sentence: "Some doors close so you finally notice who was standing beside you." If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone whose quiet kindness you may have overlooked, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Dream Discipline. Your support helps stories about compassion, healing, and second chances reach people who may need them more than we realize. And before this story ends, I have one special request. Comment "I'll notice the quiet love" if you believe the most meaningful people in our lives are sometimes the ones we almost fail to see, because that is what I learned from Maren. We spend so much of life expecting important moments to arrive with fireworks that we overlook the sunlight already filling the room. We search for dramatic proof that someone cares while ignoring the coffee waiting beside our keys, the person who remembers our worst days, the voice asking whether we made it home safely, the friend who keeps showing up when there is nothing impressive to gain. I nearly lost the best thing that ever happened to me because I believed love had to be unmistakable before I was brave enough to trust it. But sometimes love does not shout. Sometimes it sits across from you on ordinary mornings, shares the grocery bill, laughs with you in a hallway full of fallen apples, and waits patiently for you to understand. And if you are fortunate enough to finally recognize it, maybe the bravest thing you can do is stop running, turn around, and say, "I see it now."